Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We'll continue with our course on Introduction to DSGE Economics. And today we'll talk about overlapping generations models. And what I'll do in this presentation is go through a paper that Doug and I wrote and Haikaz has replicated that goes through a lot of the economics and model simulations for lots of different variations of different types of different calibrations of really what I would say is the workhorse OLG model based on the Blanchard-Yari-Vail framework. So with that as kind of a broad context, we go to the next slide, please. So here's kind of a roadmap of the presentation today. Maybe by way of introduction, just to say a few words in terms of what we've been talking about. Haikaz and Doug and I have been talking about representative agent models, the RBC framework, where we started, the DSGE framework. These are basically infinite horizon representative agent models. And we've been talking about some of the limitations that those models have. And so that kind of motivates today's presentation, where we'll shift to an overlapping generations framework, specifically where we're talking about finite horizons, where agents will look different. You'll have agents that are coming into the model, they'll be born. There'll be agents that are exiting the model that will die. That creates population turnover, and we'll add other features that allow for agents to look different from one another. That heterogeneity that you get in the overlapping generations framework is, I think, is kind of the fundamental shift, the paradigm change that we're talking about in this class of models versus the other classes of models that we've been talking about in this course. Once we go through the basic model, then we'll look at what a small open economy version of the OLG model looks like, and then also look at the closed economy, what the key equilibrating mechanisms are in both. Then we'll talk about some of the extensions across these different models, things like liquidity constraints, demographics, population growth, these kinds of things that will allow the model to have an even wider range of applications to real-world policy questions. We'll talk about some technical issues, income profiles, how we calibrate them. Income profiles, as you'll see, is one of the key ways in which we'll introduce kind of life cycle features into the OLG framework versus a more kind of dynastic version. And again, I'll talk more about that. And then we'll talk about some technical issues around Newton-Raphson methods for solutions. And then I'll talk about some of the model results and some of the model intuition from this framework. So that's to give you a rough overview of what we'll talk about today. If we can go to the next slide, please. So just in terms of some of the technical papers that the presentation is based on, there is this IMF working paper that we wrote many years ago, almost 25 years ago, that kind of really maps out these kind of OLG models across a whole range of parameterizations. So allows you to compare some of the key model properties under different interpretations of the model. And this is the paper here. There's actually another paper before this one, written by Doug and myself and Steve Szymanski, that was a shorter paper that looked at this basic idea of how to generate big debt non-neutralities in these OLG models. What do you need to get that? Part of the motivation for that was, that paper was written in the mid to late 1990s, and back then we were worried about the increase in government debt. And then what the potential crowding out effects might be, what the implications would be for higher interest rates. And, it's funny that we were worried about that, so many years ago. for a much smaller increase in debt than we've seen over the last, say, 10, 20 years, in the time since then, particularly since the global financial crisis and with the pandemic, with COVID-19. The increase in public debt has been much, much larger than the ones that we were worried about in the mid-1990s that motivated us to write some of these papers. And so really going forward, this is kind of an interesting question for the global economy in terms of where we're headed in terms of real interest rates, in a context of high public debt, a debt overhang, as some would call it. And this kind of framework that we'll talk about today can help us look at some of those issues. Next slide, please. So in terms of the OLG framework, we'll now move away from a context of infinite horizons and representative agents to finite horizons and heterogeneity with overlapping generations of agents. And there are really kind of two ways you can think about agents. One is where agents are really family lines or dynasties, if you like. There was a paper by Robert Barrow in the early 70s where he kind of reignited interest in the old Ricardian equivalence view. And the idea behind Barrow was that, if you care about your children, future generations in your family line as much as you do about yourself, then, changes in public debt, the shift between tax financing and debt financing doesn't really matter all that much. You have this equivalence feature, this Ricardian equivalence property, because, if you care about your children the way you care about yourself, if you have, say, an increase in government debt today, you'll eventually have an increase in future taxes. And even if you're not around to pay for it, if you care about your children the way you care about yourself, you would still internalize that and react to that increase in debt, that increase in public dissaving with higher private saving initially. So these kinds of notions of Barrow dynasties was kind of what prompted this kind of look again into these OLG models. And in this framework, when we look at the Blanchard-Yarry-Vail framework, that's the first interpretation of an agent, would be this kind of dynasty, but a dynasty with a finite, finite horizon. So dynasties come and go, and that's the kind of first interpretation of what an agent looks like. And when you have that kind of, and we'll talk more about this later when we see some of the model results, you'll see that in the model with overlapping dynasties, these Barrow dynasties, national saving, doesn't change very much when you have, tax financing or debt financing. So, for example, if the government were to borrow and issue debt and dissave initially, increasing its level of indebtedness, private saving would almost respond almost equivalently, so that national saving wouldn't change very much. And so the model under that Barrow dynasty interpretation is that it follows not quite a Ricardian equivalence, but something very close to that, in that kind of view of the world. And we're going to contrast that to a very different view of agents, which are agents seen as individuals, and looking at it more as kind of a life cycle model in the spirit of Modigliani. And in that case, agents aren't these family lines, but they're really individuals that are disconnected from each other. And what we'll show is that, in contrast to the dynastic version, that the real effects of government debt can actually be quite large when you bring in those kind of life cycle features and interpret agents in that way. The kind of basic framework of this whole approach really builds on the Blanchard model, which is a very nice tractable mathematical model that lets us nest both types of agents, both interpretations of agents in the same framework. And we'll talk about that as we go along. Next slide, please. So the basic model, as I mentioned, is an economy with overlapping agents. We'll have one of those two interpretations that I talked about. There'll be finite time horizons, finite planning horizons for each of these agents. So that means there's a positive probability of death. So they're no longer this infinite horizon framework. So in the case where we're talking about these Barrow dynasties, the probability of death is the likelihood that the family line comes to an end. And then with the life cycle model, when we're talking about individuals, the probability of death is related to the end of an individual's lifetime or life expectancy. And then just in terms of notation, the probability of death, in either case, we'll use this notation P as the probability of death. It'll be based on an exponential function to allow aggregation. So in terms of the expected time until death or the planning horizon, that's given by 1 over P. So just to give you some numbers, suppose that the probability of death is a number like 2%, which is not too different from what we think about for individuals. Then 1 over 0.02 is 50 years is kind of the planning horizon for maybe an individual. If you think about a number like 0.01 or 0.001, say as a probability of death, and you're thinking about a planning horizon of 100 years or even 1,000 years, if you think about a dynasty, for example. And then, in terms of what this does is it adds the finite horizon feature to the OLG framework, and then to kind of keep the population constant, which is what we'll start with. There's also a birth rate equal to that death rate. So there's an arrival rate that's the same as the exit rate, and then that will keep the size of the total population constant, at least for now. And then just to keep things simple, we'll normalize that size of the population to 1, to unity. Okay, next slide, please. So let's start with Haikaz has kind of gone through this sort of exercise in the RBC case. When we talk about the consumer's problem, the household problem, we'll do the exact same kind of thing in this framework, looking at utility maximization, expected utility over the planning horizon of individual households, subject to a budget constraint, and then in this equation 1 you see here, we have the dynamic equation, the law of motion for household wealth. And you can see the notation. Let me just to help people understand this. W is wealth, S is the index for that particular generation, and T is the time index. So in this model, because we now have overlapping generations, we have to keep track of these generations, and S is that index, that vintage of which generation we're talking about. So if you're talking about someone very old like Doug, the index would be like the baby boomer generation. I'm not as old as Doug, but I'm pretty old too, so I would be Gen X. And then we have young people like Asya and Haikaz. We have millennials and Gen Y and Gen Z. Just those different. That S is the index in this model that keeps track of the different vintages of different generations, and because generations look different, you have to keep track of that in this framework. And again, that's to help you think about how this framework differs from the representative agent framework. If everybody looks identical, you don't need the generation index with the representative agent framework. Now you need to keep track of it, and then but the rest of it looks similar to what Haikaz has talked about. So financial wealth here, the change in financial wealth with the time derivative W dot is related to asset income, which is the first term, plus disposable income minus consumption. And so that's saving in the model is total income minus consumption, and that leads to asset accumulation in how much assets you'll have next period. So in this equation, in addition to financial wealth W, you have income of the household, minus taxes, tau, minus consumption of that individual household, again, indexed by the generation. And that's so that first term, Y minus tau, is disposable income minus consumption. And the first term is the returns on your financial assets. You can see the interest rate there as the return on financial assets. Now, there's one sort of technical point here. You can see there's also a P term there. That shows you that there's an additional return on financial assets here with that P term, which is related to workings of an annuity market or life insurance markets in this model, so that we're diversifying that risk around these finite horizons, and individuals receive these annuity payments, P times a fraction of their financial wealth. In exchange, when they die, they will turn over their wealth to the life insurance company. This is an assumption that Yari talked about a long time ago, and that helps diversify the risk around lifetime uncertainty. Okay, so that's basically the some of the intuition behind this equation here. R is the interest rate, as I mentioned. In the small open economy example we'll talk about later, R will be fixed at the world real interest rate. And in the closed economy case, R will be endogenously determined to equilibrate saving and investment. Okay, next slide, please. So here's the consumer's problem. Similar to some of the optimization problems you've seen before. Here now it's the case of consumers, households maximizing expected utility over their lifetimes. In equation 2, we've added the assumption of log utility. Of course, you could relax that assumption, but we'll start with that to keep it simple. Notice that from equation 2, we can move from expected utility to a closed form because we're using that, again, that exponential rate of death, e to the minus p, that allows us to rewrite the expected utility function in terms of the probability of death coming in there through that exponential function. Theta here is the rate of time preference we've been using, I think. It's related, of course, to the discount factor that you might have seen in the previous models in terms of beta. Theta is close to that term in this framework. And if you solve out the optimization problem, you can get under log utility this equation 3, which shows that consumption can be written as a marginal propensity to consume. That's a constant theta plus p as a fraction of your permanent income. And permanent income is your financial wealth plus this new term H, which is your human wealth. And the expression for human wealth is given in equation 4. It's the present value of your future labor income. So, if you think about the permanent income hypothesis, that this is essentially what that implies, that consumption is a function of permanent income, which is in this model your financial wealth, and the present value of your future labor income, disposable future labor income, which is the term H here. And under log utility, we'll generalize this later, but under log utility, the marginal propensity to consume is a constant fraction related to the rate of time preference theta, and implicitly the probability of death adds a kind of discount factor, if you like, and that helps determine your marginal propensity to consume. So next slide, please. Then one of the beauties of the Blanchard model is its aggregation properties are very tractable, and it's easy to aggregate up those individual consumption functions that you saw in the previous slide, and then we use, in this case, uppercase variables to denote aggregate variables. And here we've dropped the time index as well. Here we're aggregating consumption over all the generations, all those S's, and then deriving aggregate consumption, which is a function of aggregate financial wealth and aggregate human wealth. And then those are denoted here with the capital W and the capital H. In the case of the small open economy case that we'll talk more about, financial wealth can be held in terms of holdings of equity of capital in the model, debt, government bonds, and in the case of the open economy, net foreign assets F as well. So those are the three ways in which you can hold financial wealth in the case of the small open economy case. When we have the closed economy case, F will be constrained to be always 0, and then you'll have just the holdings of debt and equity, of capital and domestic bonds. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now let's come back to how we think about agents in the model, partly as we started off the presentation. So let's start with the case of these Barrow dynasties. So here you have the agent not as an individual, but as a family line. And so the lifetime of that agent could far exceed that of an individual member. And that will influence, for example, what you might think of as the probability of death. So you might think of P being a smaller number, a smaller probability of death, and a longer planning horizon than in the case of an individual. Human wealth, interestingly, in this case, you want to think about this not as a disposable income stream of an individual, but of the family itself. So the income stream available to that dynastic household over time. So, a good way to think about this is, think about, you've seen these family businesses, father and son cleaners, or mother and daughter cleaners, for example. Think of that where the business is kind of handed over to the next generation, and they hand it over to the next generation. They'll have an income stream for that household over time that will be this kind of family line. And so when you make that assumption, all households in the model can be treated identically with respect to labor earnings. So every household, dynastic household, earns the same amount. Their family business are all earning this kind of symmetric assumption that will be earning the same amount regardless of their age. So if you do that, income and also labor taxes are not generation specific. So you can drop the S, the generation index, and each generation will have will earn the same amount, and because of the assumption of the size of the population, you have this result that individual dynastic household income is just equal to the aggregate income, and the same thing on the tax side. And then with respect to the the other assumptions, you can express the notion of human wealth in terms of this aggregate variable H. There is one sort of small technical issue here, which is that, so what we're basically saying is that in the case of dynastic households, labor income looks the same across these households, but wealth doesn't look the same. So just to make that point very clear, agents are born in the model without wealth. So wealth is 0 at the time that a new dynastic household comes into existence. They'll look the same in terms of labor income, but the older dynastic households will have higher wealth than the younger dynastic households. So they will look different in that dimension, but they'll look the same with respect to labor income. And so you can express aggregate human wealth as an aggregation of all these individual human wealth processes for across these households, and that's equation 6 that you see here with respect to the evolution of human wealth in the model. Next slide, please. So that's the dynastic case where households all earn the same level of income and have the same disposable income. They'll have different wealth profiles. There'll be different points with respect to their level of financial wealth, but they'll look the same with respect to their human wealth and their disposable income. In the case of life cycle income, we'll relax that assumption. So to kind of move away from the dynastic case and think about agents not as family lines, but as individuals, then you're looking at the individual income profile over a person's lifetime. And so that will add more of a life cycle feature to the model versus the dynastic case. And we'll look at the implications of that later. But for now, just think about what your income profile looks like over your lifetime. Usually we start working, we graduate from school, and we enter the workforce, and we'll have usually a rising income profile as we work. That might peak as we hit middle age, and then at some point we'll go into retirement, and then our labor earnings will decline. And so you have this kind of non-monotonic or hump-shaped pattern to your income profile on average. And then we'll show you some empirical results on what those income profiles look like, for example, in the US. But you can think about this as kind of a hump-shaped income profile as the time profile of your labor earnings over your working life. And so in the case of thinking about individuals, we will introduce this equation 7, which gives you that non-monotonic hump-shaped income profile. And then eventually I'll show you some calibrations of what that can look like to match the real world data. What we've done to keep things tractable is just make it an additive function of 2 exponentials where the coefficients A1 and A2 have opposite sign. That'll help give us this kind of hump-shaped profile for individual labor income in the case where we're thinking about the life cycle version of the model. Okay, next slide, please. So in that case where we have individuals look different, not only with respect to their age and when they come in, but they also look different with respect to their earnings, because they'll be in a different point in their age earnings profile. The aggregation will look a little different than what we had before in the dynastic case. But with the exponential functions that we use, you can express it, the aggregate human wealth equation, as this function of these 2 components with the alpha 1 and the alpha 2 from those individual income profiles. Those will show up in the aggregate human wealth equations. But it's very similar to the aggregations that we did before, just in the case of now individual hump-shaped income profiles. We'll add this additional richness in the human wealth equation. In terms of the economics, adding income profiles actually will increase the discount factor, the private discount factor in the model. You can sort of see it here in equations 9 and 10. You see R plus P plus alpha 1 and R plus P plus alpha 2. That will be related to effectively the discount rates on future labor income. The alpha 1s and alpha 2s kind of show reflect the fact that eventually labor income declines. You eventually move into retirement over your life cycle, and that effectively adds another discount factor in terms of what your future disposable income will be. Why does that matter? Well, one of the key intuitions from the OLG framework is that non-Ricardian properties in the model, why does Ricardian equivalence fail, is because of a wedge between public and private discount rates. And in the dynastic case, you have the P factor there, the fact that there's a finite horizon, that a dynastic household may not be around in the future to pay future taxes, and that discount factor enters into the private notion of their intertemporal budget constraint. In the life cycle case, you'll see these alphas entering as well, and the idea is that I, as an individual, I might not be around. That's what the P factor sort of represents. But I might be around, but I'll have less disposable labor income in the future. I might have retired in the future. And so the tax base that I would have to pay for future taxes would be lower. And that adds an additional private discount factor. And we can talk about that later, but this is kind of to give you some intuition on why the introduction of these life cycle features will help us understand why the effects of government debt will look larger. And the intuition is because private and public discount rates the wedge between them will also look larger. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, so as far as the small open economy case, just to help close the model, we're going to assume that the small open economy acts as a price taker. There'll be a single good in the model, and we'll use that to as the numeraire. We'll express everything in real terms in terms of that single internationally traded good. So we're moving away from some of the richness that you saw from the open economy models that we talked about before. We're going to focus more on the OLG side of things, and then there'll be this global market not only for goods but also for capital, and that there'll be a single world real interest rate that's exogenous to the small open economy, equal to the world real interest rate that the small open economy can borrow freely at in the presence of international capital mobility. One of the implications of that for this model is that because the small open economy takes the interest rate as given, you can actually have a separation between investment and saving, depending on the small open economy relative to the rest of the world. S does not have to equal I, and you can have the small open economy borrow or lend at that global interest rate, and that will have implications for, say, the current account and the net foreign asset position for that small open economy. When we go back to the closed economy version, saving and investment will have to be equal to each other, and the interest rate will have to do the work as the equilibrating mechanism. In this case, the interest rate is fixed at the global level, and saving and investment can actually can differ as a result of that, depending on the properties of the small open economy, including the level of government debt. And I guess the last feature here is that there's, to close the model, I'll talk about this more later, there'll be an external sector, the trade balance in the current account, and of course we'll close the model with the public sector as well. There'll be also, when we've talked more about the consumer's problem, there'll also be a firm problem when we talk about investment behavior, and we'll use kind of standard assumptions on what determines investment in the model, both in the closed economy case and the small open economy case. Next slide, please. So here is that investment problem that I mentioned, and it's a standard one. It's kind of if you think of Tobin's firms maximizing the present value of net cash flows, their production minus their labor costs, minus investment, including A, which is an installation costs of investment. It'll allow us to keep investment from being too, from the capital stock from being too jumpy. We'll have, in the spirit of Lucas and Treadway, we have this installation function for capital with some convex, in this case, quadratic costs that you see in equation 12 for installation costs of each unit of installed capital from investment I. So when you think about total investment expenditure, it'll be gross investment I plus A, which is the installation costs on top of it. And this is kind of a standard investment, investment problem. You'll see later that there'll be a kind of Tobin's Q type result that gives you the investment function where the where the installation costs of capital relative to the additional revenue that you receive from the additional unit of installed capital have to be equilibrated as part of the firm's investment decision. Next slide, please. So here is what it looks like in terms of the investment function from this model with the with this standard kind of neoclassical approach to the investment decision. You have investment in terms of Q, which is Tobin's Q, and it's related to the value of an additional unit of installed capital relative to its marginal returns. Delta here is the depreciation rate, and then you get this investment function as a function of Q relative to 1 plus the depreciation rate. And then you have in equation 14 the laws of motion for the aggregate capital stock as a function of net investment, which is gross investment I minus the depreciation rate of capital based on the depreciation rate delta in equation 14. Next equation, or next slide, please. And then we have, I guess here we have the public sector is again the standard sorts of assumptions. We have government expenditures G. We have lump sum taxation in this case a T that can be derived in different ways. We can extend that in other with other types of assumptions, such as proportional to income. But for now, we have the lump sum taxation assumption, and then government debt B, which is the stock of public debt. You have the laws of motion here, the change in government debt related to interest payments on the existing stock, new expenditure, the flow of government spending in that period, less its revenues would be related to the evolution of public debt. Next slide, please. And then in the small open economy case, we have kind of the standard set of equations that talk about the external sector. You have, in this case, you have GDP, which is a function of capital and labor. Labor is normalized to 1 with the assumptions we have for the size of the population that I mentioned before. And so GNP, or national income, is defined as GDP plus the interest on NFA. That's what you see in equation 16. And then you have this notion for national savings equal to national income less public and private spending in equation 17. And then, with this, we are in a open economy setting. So you have this difference between, absorption can differ from production, and that's related to the trade balance. Just know that in this model, because we have these installation costs of capital, that total expenditure includes not just I, but the installation costs A. So we call that I tilde expression in equation 18. And then you have basically saving minus investment equals, well, at least in terms of saving minus investment equaling the current account, and in terms of excluding factor incomes, saving minus investment equaling the trade balance there in equation 18. And then the last equation there is the standard one, that the evolution of net foreign assets depends on the current account. The difference between national saving and total investment would determine the amount of borrowing or lending by the domestic economy. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to kind of go back to the closed economy case, we've talked about the small open economy version of the model. It's actually nests nicely within that framework. Just have domestic saving equaling total investment, so zero capital mobility, and so the current account is always zero, saving always equals investment in that closed economy case, and the rate of capital accumulation then doesn't depend on the global interest rate in the small open economy setting, but really on the intermediation between savers and investors in the closed economy setting, where the interest rate has to adjust to equilibrate saving and investment. And that's effectively the difference there. So in this case, the interest rate will be endogenous, whereas in the small open economy case, we had this result of an exogenous interest rate at the level of the world real interest rate. Here we'll have an endogenous domestic real interest rate that has to clear the level between saving and investment. Next slide, please. So in terms of the closed economy case, we have under perfect competition. We've talked about that in the RBC model. You have a similar result here, that the interest rate is equal to the net marginal product of capital. Here, the derivative of the production function with respect to K, and the depreciation rate. In the case where we have these installation costs of capital, then you have the evolution of the capital stock as a function of investment, which you have as f of k minus c minus g, minus those installation costs of capital, and of course the amount of capital that depreciates each period. So that's the right-hand side of equation 22 is related to net investment. Next slide, please. We've talked about log utility before. This slide just shows you what the math looks like if you want to move to the case of constant relative risk aversion, or CRA utility. The special case that we've been talking about up until now is where the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, the sigma term, has been 1 in the case of log utility. But if you were to relax that assumption, you would get a slightly different equation where the marginal propensity to consume out of permanent income is not a constant, but is this delta to the -1 term, where the interest rate enters into the marginal propensity to consume out of that permanent income, out of that financial and human wealth. So we've been talking about a special case where the evolution of that delta that you see in equation 25, where that MPC is a constant, so that delta dot is equal to 0, and you have the marginal propensity to consume as a fixed fraction, theta plus p. This is what it would look like under the CRA utility equation. The main point here being that with CRA utility versus log utility, the marginal propensity to consume out of permanent income has sensitivity to the interest rate in that more generalized case. And you see that in equation 25 with the RT term there in the evolution of delta. Okay, next equation, please. Or next slide. Okay, so far we've been talking about the case of capital markets working well, capital mobility at the international level, but also at the domestic level. And one of the things you can do in this model is introduce, let me call it a financial friction. It's a very simplified version of one, but the idea that not all generations in the model could freely borrow, even at the given interest rate. There are a lot of reasons for that. Empirically, when you look at, there's some nice papers that look at, individual microdata on the evolution of not only wealth profiles over time, but also saving and income profiles over time. And this notion that, younger generations who tend to be income and asset poor often don't have the ability to borrow. They don't have a credit history, for example. Many of you might have come into encounter that problem. And so we can introduce those types of financial frictions in the model. And the way that we're going to do that is we make the assumption that the youngest generations in the model, up to some oldest generation that can't borrow, and we call that indexed by the letter I here, small I, that share of the population are liquidity constrained, and we'll keep that fraction of the population, lambda, constant, and we'll assume that at least for that portion of the population, that they will be liquidity constrained and not being able to borrow at the interest rate R. Again, as a way to introduce some credit market imperfections, at least to represent what people think about in terms of credit rationing and financial market imperfections. And this is kind of one kind of shortcut way in which we can introduce that into this OLSU framework. So lambda will represent the fixed proportion of liquidity constrained individuals in the economy. A way you can think about it is, we've talked about heterogeneity. This is kind of introducing another form of heterogeneity in the model. You'll now have two types of agents. You'll have permanent income consumers and current income consumers in the model, where these share lambda of current income consumers are constrained, not able to borrow, and consumption will then be a function of their disposable income. Next slide, please. So once you do that, you have changes in the aggregate consumption that we talked about earlier. So in the case of when we introduce liquidity constraints, equation 27 is close to what you would get. So if you look at it, you can look at it really as a sum of two parts. The first part you saw before, which was coming from the consumption function in the absence of liquidity constraints. And you had, in the case of log utility, consuming a fixed fraction of your permanent income, W plus H. Now, in this case, permanent income consumers aren't part of the entire population, so they're only 1 minus lambda of the population. They own all the financial wealth in the economy, so their share of consumption will be that first term. And then you have the current income consumers, the ones who are liquidity constrained, where their consumption is a function of their disposable income, and that's the lambda y minus t term there. So that's how the aggregate consumption function would be modified when you have a share of the population consuming out of current income and a share of the population consuming out of permanent income. For those of you who know the work of Campbell and Mankiw, you think about consumption functions and the notion of excess sensitivity, even in the presence of permanent income consumers. You might have this, empirically, you find this result that tends to be this excess sensitivity of consumption to disposable income. In this model, you introduce these liquidity constraints, you can try to replicate some of those empirical features there. So in terms of aggregate consumption, you can help match some of the moments with this assumption of liquidity constraints. In terms of the behavioral properties of the model, as I mentioned, you now have some consumers who are consuming out of current disposable income and others consuming out of their permanent income. What that means for the behavior of changes in government debt, that will also have an impact, as we'll see when we talk about the results at the end. Next slide, please. Now this is just an extension of that same model where we've added liquidity constraints, and we've also added those life cycle income profiles, and then you get these interactive terms between the lambda and the alphas that we saw before with the parameters in the Humpshaped income profiles. And the math in equation 28 just shows you what the aggregate consumption function would look like when you put in those interactive terms, where not only you have life cycle income profiles, but then you also have a fraction of those consumers who are also consuming out of that life cycle income, and where their consumption is tied by that level of disposable income, and those interactive terms are represented here in equation 28. Next slide, please. When we talk about extensions of the model, I've been assuming throughout the discussion today about a stationary or a constant population that was normalized to unity, but the model is rich enough that you can actually introduce population change, population growth. You can have differences between the birth rate and the death rate, and call that N, that gap between B minus P. We've been assuming that B and P were the same, and N was 0 and B equaled P. But you could relax that assumption, and that allows for changes in population growth. In the case where you think of agents as dynasties, it would be changes in the number of those dynastic households would be changing over time. In the case where you're thinking of individuals, you could relate these really to fertility and mortality rates, the inflow and outflow of people into the economy. And then once you do that, you would need to keep track of the size of the population at any moment in time, and that would be a function of the historical birth and death rates, and that's what the equation for the integral for representing N of t would be a function of, looking back over the evolution of those key population, those key demographic variables on B and P, on fertility and mortality rates. The other extension that you can do straightforward in the model is assuming long-term productivity growth. We use the notation here mu. That will increase the scale of the economy over time if variables are growing, key macro variables are growing along, say, a balanced growth path at the alongside productivity growth. And then you'll have to do some scaling in terms of efficiency units of labor related to the growth of the population and the rate of productivity growth, mu. And that's what that last bullet point is referring to in terms of the case of long-term population and productivity growth. Next slide, please. Okay, so putting those pieces together, you can actually then have a further extension where we put all the different parts together. You have life cycle income, That's the first part of equation 29, those hump-shaped profiles that we've discussed before. And then you have growth in the overall population. So you have, at a population growth n. So then in that case, what you need to do is express individual labor income in relative terms, relative to average income per capita. And that's the last term outside the square brackets in equation 29. There's an adding up constraint that's also needed so that individual labor incomes YS of T add up when you aggregate them across all generations to Y of T. And that's what the adding up constraint reflects. And then you can also talk about what human wealth dynamics look like in that case where you have these long run trends in the size of the population or productivity growth. And then equations 30 through 32 would be these dynamic equations for human wealth normalized in efficiency units of labor, normalized because of that n is positive and mu is positive in terms of population and productivity growth. And that's effectively what these equations allow you to do, keeping things tractable when scale variables are increasing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we've been talking about these income profiles for a while. And they introduce, as I said before, this life cycle feature of the model that was kind of missing in the kind of view of thinking of agents as barrow dynasties. And then the question then becomes, how to calibrate those income profiles to kind of choose those key parameters that I mentioned would have an impact on private discount rates. So what we would do here is look at, kind of a relative income profile. And you can think of a relative income profile as the individual income profile as a set of coefficients with these two exponential functions as a factor of aggregate labor income per capita, the average income per capita. And you can think of individuals as being above or below that average income per capita relative based on that function, based on their age. So the term in brackets here, those two exponentials and that function of t minus s, that's the function of the age of that particular generation s, that effectively gives you these generation-specific weights, if you like, on the income per capita, on the average income per capita for the economy as a whole. And that's effectively how you can characterize relative incomes, for each generation relative to the average income per capita for the overall economy. Next slide, please. So here we just talk about some specification issues on getting the hump-shaped income profiles that we want. Those impose certain parameter restrictions for the coefficients A1 and A2, and then again also to be to have the income profiles be strictly positive, but eventually declining. There are various parameter restrictions that you can look at through this set of slides here. Again, just different restrictions on those to generating a set of age-specific weights in the income profiles that give you the kind of hump-shaped income profiles that we see in the data. And effectively what those bullet points are referring to are these parameter restrictions that give you that shape that we'll see in the data in a moment. I think one question people often ask me is that, you have this hump-shaped income profile, but in the real world, people work and they stop working and you get this discontinuity in their labor income. And that's certainly true. What the model does is kind of abstracts away from those individual income profiles in the real world and looks at an average income profile. So where retirement is more kind of a smoothed out aggregation or averaging across retirements at different ages. So you can think of people in their, say, mid-50s onwards. Let's say people are retiring at different times. You could think of the average income profile as capturing that kind of averaging of over those different retirement ages. And that's effectively what the income profile does. Is you can think of it as kind of an average income profile that still gives you that notion that income is rising initially as we gain experience in the workforce and we're gaining, say, seniority wages, and our income levels tend to go up. And then eventually the non-monotonic feature is that eventually we'll have this gradual retirement in the model. And that's just really, think of that as a simplification of people retiring at different ages. And that just gives you a gradual retirement where labor income tends to decline. The last bullet here talks about an adding up constraint that gives you a cross parameter restrictions, just to make sure that individual labor income profiles add up to the aggregate. That's equation 34. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of data and estimation, so we actually then went to the data, looked at labor income and employment by age in the US. And then we constructed, basically getting this cross-sectional information, looking at the distribution of real labor income by age groups. And we looked at it from ages from 20, 30, 40, all the way through 75, essentially, and taking the midpoints of those age groups across those different cohorts to get the data for the time profile of labor earnings. And then what we do is then we look at what those data look like across different vintages from 1980 through 1995. What's interesting there, what I'll say, is that age earnings profiles, at least in relative terms, tend to be relatively stable. What 20-year-olds earn relative to 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds doesn't vary too much. Although you'll see there'll be some variation when you look at data across different years. But we look at both that cross section and that time spans of the data when we look at these income profiles, and then we do our calibration of the model by trying to fit a hump-shaped income profile that best fits that longitudinal data that we have in the data set. Next slide, please. So this just shows you, what some of those parameter estimates look like for those age earnings profiles. You can see the estimates of the alpha parameters. In this case, we used, I think in the equations I showed 2 exponentials, but you could generalize it to any number of exponentials, k. We chose 3 in the data set to help us fit these age earnings profiles. You can see from the R-squareds, you actually get fairly good fits for this functional form to fit the age earnings profiles, to the US data. Next slide, please. So this just shows you from those previous estimates in that table what the age earnings profile fits look like. Let me just stay away from the lines, which are the estimated age earnings profiles, and I'll just focus on the triangles there. Those triangles show you the relative incomes of different age groups for the US, their labor earnings at different ages from 1980 through 1995. So you'll see different triangles there for the different time, the different time vintages of each data set. And then you can see here the relative earnings by age group. So for example, if you look at 20-year-olds, 20-year-olds earn, a number that's close to 50% or a little less than 50% of the average income, income per capita, during the sample size. As you get older, you earn more you go above 1 in terms of 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds earning more than the average income per capita. And then as you get older and people work less, you have this kind of gradual retirement kind of feature that I talked about. 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds earn well below the average income per capita. Certainly by the time you're 75, you earn well below the average income per capita because you've effectively are out of the workforce at that age. So 60-year-olds, you're getting close to retirement, but you're earning basically close to the average income per capita at that point, and then beyond that, you're moving into retirement. And again, in the model, it's kind of a gradual retirement phase. Your working hours go down on average, and that's what the hump-shaped income profile tries to match. So that's to give you a sense on how we calibrate those life cycle age earnings profiles. And you can do that for, different countries would have different data with respect to the relative earnings across young workers, middle-aged, older workers, middle-aged workers, and older workers, different depending on their labor market institutions. And so you would try to calibrate this to each country's cross-sectional relative age earnings, income profiles, that data for that particular country, and that would help you calibrate those particular parameters in the OLG model. Next slide, please. Why don't we go ahead and we'll go ahead and skip this part of this, talking about some methods for these solution techniques. I'll come back to this maybe at the end. If we can go ahead and skip to the next slide, skip this one too. And why don't we go ahead and go to the model properties? So we go to the slide. We'll stop with the previous slide. Okay, so why don't we talk, why don't I finish up about the model itself and what the OLG framework buys us in terms of non-Ricardian properties in the model, and give you some of the model intuition for it. And then we can come back to some of the technical issues at the end. So just to talk about the steady state of this model, we'll assume that labor income is, in the absence of productivity growth, as a simplifying assumption, you can have labor income. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry for that. So as I mentioned, we'll have some simplifying assumptions here. Look to give you a simple steady state. We'll assume that labor income at the aggregate household level is simply a constant, and without loss of generality, we can normalize that to unity. And then human wealth in that case would also be a constant. And then we'll also what we'll have is that an agent's consumption would be rising over time. Why is that? Because you'll have an accumulation of financial wealth. And so asset income does rise over time in the model, even if the labor income remains constant. So consumption will be on a rising income profile. And again, the importance of that is coming back to this broader point that individual agents don't all look the same, depending on where you are in your, whether you're a dynastic household that's relatively new, or one that's been around a long time. You'll look different, even if when you look the same with respect to labor income, you can look different with respect to wealth and asset income. You'll have older households that are relatively wealthier, have higher asset incomes, higher consumption, and that heterogeneity turns out to be really critical in terms of the model properties. Next slide, please. So this just kind of shows you some of the features there that I mentioned before, where we're assuming labor income, that blue line is horizontal, but you can see in the model in steady state, the behavior of asset accumulation and total income will be on a rising profile, as will consumption. So you have this feature of the model where things like, the age of the agent will make them look different with respect to the levels of some of these key variables, even if other variables like, say, labor income look the same. There's enough heterogeneity with the OLG framework where other features will make agents look different from one another. The bottom slide shows you the evolution of wealth in the model, and you can see that agents are born with zero wealth and then accumulate wealth over time as they move forward. So there is some positive saving that's going on in the model through that period and through that wealth accumulation. So consumption will be below total income, and you can see that from the previous slide, and that is leading to the accumulation of financial wealth through the agent's timing or planning horizon, in this case the dynastic for the dynastic household. Next slide, please. So now, if moving from that dynastic case, what would things look like in the case of life cycle incomes? Remember, these life cycle incomes are these hump-shaped income profiles that I mentioned before, where you think about entering the workforce and having rising income as you gain experience in the workforce, and then eventually peaking and going down as you move into gradual retirement. You have that non-monotonic income profile. We still solve the same consumers problem and then see what the consumption profile looks like relative to that. But with respect to what agents would like to do, you might think of a case where agents would like to borrow initially because they see this rising income profile initially, but they may be income poor initially, and they would like to smooth consumption over their lifetimes and actually maybe borrow against some of that rising future labor earnings. Middle-aged agents, will eventually start to see their income level peak and come down, and they'll want to maintain their consumption levels in the absence of labor income. So they have consumption smoothing both on the front end and on the back end, and that's effectively what the kind of permanent income hypothesis would suggest. So that's effectively what we would think about the steady state profiles for consumption relative to income in the case of life cycle income profiles. Next slide, please. So this just shows you what that looks like. So just to show you the blue line in the upper panel, you can see a steady state income profile that's hump shaped, as I mentioned before, where 20-year-olds are earning less relative to middle-aged workers in their 30s and 40s and 50s. Eventually then, as agents move further out, labor earnings decline as agents move gradually into retirement, and that's the blue path for your labor earnings. You can see that consumption tends to be very smooth, and then that depends a lot on the taste parameters, the rate of time preference, whether you have also with CRA Utility and what the interest rate is in that case in steady state. And you have, you can see this broadly flat or relatively smooth consumption line there. I guess it's in orange. And implicitly, you can see that consumption is above disposable income or labor income initially, but then you have a period of savings in the middle-aged years, and then you have a period where consumption exceeds labor income when people are moving into retirement. And so the implications of that you can see are in the wealth profile in the bottom panel, where again, agents are born with zero wealth. In this case, an agent is an individual, and you'd want to actually have a period of borrowing where you're actually a net debtor, where wealth can actually maybe turn negative. You're borrowing against your future income. But then eventually you move to a period of saving when your labor income is high at the top of the hump. And that's where you have wealth accumulation moving towards effectively a target level of wealth, of financial wealth there that you can see in that blue line. The other side of it is human wealth, which is on this broadly declining path. And that's just this future present value of that hump-shaped income profile in the upper panel. So you can sort of see here that the richness of the model already is generating a lot of life cycle consumption saving behavior. Young people who are asset poor, are income poor, but see this future of rising income profiles for a long period of time, will want to borrow against that if they can. And again, in the case of liquidity constraints, there might be some financial constraints against that. But in the unconstrained model, this is sort of what they would like to do. And then you have a period where people are income rich, but maybe still on a rising asset path where financial assets are rising. And then you have retirees who have very little in the way of labor income, but maybe are asset rich. And so a lot of their total income is coming through their asset income, and that allows them to maintain their level of consumption. So again, a kind of richness across different cohorts, whether you tend to be young, middle-aged, or old. Okay, next slide, please. So, we've been spending a lot of time talking about the model structure. So now we can do some economic experiments and look at the effects of changes in government debt across all these different parameters, these different versions of the model, the dynastic case, the life cycle case, the case with liquidity constraints and so forth. And so what we do is we look at a 10 percentage point increase in public debt as a share of GDP. And we do that both in the closed economy case and the small open economy case. And some of the key variables we'll look at is what happens in the closed economy case to the real interest rate, what happens to capital output ratio. Is there what level of crowding out do we have when we have the government borrowing more? What does that do for overall saving and investment? And then we'll look at the implications for the interest rate in terms of basis points and the change in the capital stock in percent of GDP. And that'll help us benchmark, how far away are we from the kind of Ricardian equivalence version of the model when you get to the infinite horizon where P equals 0, and you're back to kind of a Ramsey model where the effects of government debt, where Ricardian equivalence exactly holds, those effects should all be 0. We'll look at how far away from 0 we can get across different versions of the model. Next slide, please. So in the case of the dynastic households, the punchline is that the effects of government debt are actually quite small. Even though we went to we moved away from representative agents and a purely Ricardian infinite horizon kind of model to one with overlapping agents and dynastic households, you don't get a lot of impact in that dynastic case. In those Barrow dynasties that I mentioned at the beginning, you care about your future generations, your family line, as much as you care about yourself. The family line may come to an end, so there is some wedge between public and private discount rates, but it's pretty small. And in that case, this is a result that people like Paul Evans and others have shown, is that model, even with overlapping generations, behaves almost like a Ricardian equivalent model. You can call it approximate Ricardian equivalence in that case. In a way, the intuition is that with the dynastic saving behavior of those households, they really are internalizing a lot of those future tax implications, especially if there is productivity growth, because you're going to have a rising labor income profile over time in that dynastic case with productivity growth, you're going to have a future tax base that's going to actually be growing in terms of worrying about future tax implications of higher debt today. And so that's kind of the intuition why the model still looks very close to an infinite horizon representative agent model. Next slide, please. And this kind of shows you what the surface looks like in that dynastic household case. So the vertical axis here is the change in the steady state interest rate in basis points for that 10% of GDP debt shock. The XY axes on the horizontal plane relate to sigma, the CRA parameter, and the degree of liquidity constraints, lambda. So for example, lambda goes from 0, no liquidity constraints, up to 30% of the population being liquidity constrained. And then we choose different values of sigma, as you can see here on that other axis. And you can see from the surface, it's pretty close to being flat. There's not a lot of impact of a debt shock on the steady state interest rate in this dynastic case. You can try raising lambda. You can try changing the sensitivity of consumption to the interest rate to see that, but you don't get much. There's not much impact. The model, as I said, is close to this kind of approximate Ricardian equivalence kind of view of the world. Next slide, please. Now this is the same thing, looking at the change in the steady state capital output ratio, and again, not a lot of effects on the capital output ratio. This is the quantity side of the previous slide. Not a lot of effects on real interest rates. Not a lot of crowding out effects on capital. There isn't really much action. The model is close to being fairly neutral with respect to the effects of changes in government debt. Next slide, please. So that was the results with the dynastic case, and now you're going to see something quite different. When you move to a kind of very different interpretation of the model, to thinking about overlapping agents as individuals with life cycle features, these income profiles that I mentioned, you could actually get some significant real effects from changes in government debt. Before we show you the results, just to give you the intuition for it, what it intuitively is happening is the wedge between the private and public discount rates are going to get larger. And as that wedge gets larger, the effects of government debt are going to be larger as well. The real effects, the non-neutralities are going to get larger. A good way to think about it is, think about two intertemporal budget constraints, one for the public sector and one for the private sector. And when you think about changes in, say, taxes and debt issuances, you're effectively moving money from one intertemporal budget constraint to the other. And if private and public discount rates look fairly similar, moving that money between one or the other doesn't really matter, and you're close to that neutrality result. Once those public and private discount factors differ, once you start moving money between the government's intertemporal budget constraint and the private sector's intertemporal budget constraint, you're going to get those non-neutralities in terms of implications for other macro variables. And that's, maybe in a more kind of simpler way of saying it, remember that an increase in, say, public debt today implies an increase in future tax liabilities, right? Because the government has to obey its intertemporal budget constraint in the model. How much of those future tax liabilities affect your current behavior is dependent on the private discount rate. And in the model where you have, say, age earnings profiles, you're going to be less worried about future taxes because you have lower taxable income in the future with those income profiles. It effectively raises that private discount rate. So that's a little bit kind of the intuition. In terms of the links between generations, we've effectively broken that altruistic link between generations in this version of the model. And so once you start introducing those life cycle features, and the effects of debt fall on future generations that you don't care about, you effectively can generate much larger real effects on the economy from changes in say public debt financing. Next slide, please. So this gives you the same debt shock in the life cycle income case, and you can see right away how much larger the effects can be, particularly as you vary the value of sigma. You can get from that 10% of GDP debt shock, where we had very small, just a couple of basis point effects. Now you're talking about effects on steady state real interest rate approaching 50, 60 basis points in this particular case of parameterization of the model. What's interesting also here, something I'll come back to at the end, you notice that as you vary lambda, you don't gain very much in terms of the change in the steady state real interest rate. If you're moving from 0 to say 0.3, the effects of government debt on the steady state interest rate don't change all that much. But as you move in the sigma direction, you actually are getting quite a big increase in the effects of steady state real interest rates rising with higher debt. Why is that? One is operating through liquidity constrained consumers. That's the lambda, and the fact that you have a fraction of the population that is consuming out of current disposable income. So as taxes change, disposable income changes, and you have that impact on total consumption. But that effect tends to be pretty small. It's working through the flow of income. The amount the taxes have to change is actually pretty small. The other dimension, you get very large effects because you're operating through a different channel, which is through the stock of human wealth, and that through that stock variable and that wedge between public and private discount factors that I mentioned. That's getting a lot more bang for your buck, so to speak, in terms of having much larger non-Ricardian effects in the model. Next slide, please. This one shows you, again, in terms of how much the steady state capital stock can change. And here you can see we're starting to now get meaningful changes in the capital stock. The capital stock is being crowded out through public borrowing and higher interest rates that you saw on the previous slide. And then you get less capital accumulation in terms of the effects of government debt, those crowding out effects that I mentioned in the case with life cycle income. Next slide, please. So the other sort of experiments that we did in this model was to look at the small open economy case. In this case, there are, because we have this assumptions of a fixed interest rate that the small open economy can borrow and lend freely at, this perfect capital mobility assumption. The capital stock is determined. So it's determined basically by the supply side. So based on the world real interest rate and the parameters that enter the production function, the marginal products of capital, the installation costs, and so forth, the capital stock is pinned down by that. And so what we're really just determining is how the what the NFA position, how much saving is affected by the changes in government debt at that given interest rate. And so we'll talk about crowding out, not in terms of the capital stock, but in terms of the NFA position. In this model, saving and investment can vary from each other. Savings, national savings, would be a function of both public and private savings. Investment is pinned down by the supply side. And so S minus I will vary depending on the debt shock, and that'll have implications for the current account and NFA. And that's effectively the thought experiment that goes on in this part of the exercise. Next slide, please. So this shows you the changes in NFA. Again, in the dynastic case, across, this is, I guess, I think probably with log utility. We're looking at different values of theta, and also which was related to the rate of time preference, and lambda, the share of liquidity constrained consumers. And here the changes in NFA for a 10% of GDP debt shock. And you can see, actually, it's interesting, you actually get a fairly sizable impact on NFA. Even in the case with dynastic households, the change in NFA, with higher public debt, you have more public dis-saving. That tends to push down national savings, and actually has a fairly large impact then on the amount that this small open economy would borrow and how much the decline in NFA is here. We have this in terms of the change in the NFA on the vertical axis, and you actually get some meaningful, even in the dynastic case, you get some meaningful crowding out effects on NFA. This country becomes a net debtor in the international markets. It becomes has a net foreign debt position that actually tends to decline in a pretty sizable amount with the increase in domestic public debt. Next slide, please. And you get even larger effects in the life cycle case. You can see here the steady state effects of a fiscal debt shock when you add life cycle income. And again, sort of most of the action is coming through the stock of human wealth. The lambda effects aren't particularly large, or they don't change very much over the variation of lambda, the share of liquidity constrained consumers. Again, that's operating through a flow of disposable income, whereas on the other axis, you're operating through the stock of human wealth and the role of private discount rates varying from public discount rates. But really interestingly, in both cases, you actually get very sizable implications in the small open economy, where public debt crowds out a lot of NFA. An increase in public debt, a decrease in public saving really tends to push down national savings quite a bit, and the country ends up borrowing in international capital markets. The role of capital mobility in both the dynastic case and the life cycle income case leaves you with some fairly sizable non-Ricardian properties in the model in either version of the overlapping agents framework. Next slide, please. And this just provides you with a summary of the model that we've been talking about. I won't go through it again here, but this shows you, basically the key aggregate consumption functions, now based on not representative agents, but an overlapping agents framework. Keep in mind those individual consumption profiles look different. Consumption is different across different age groups in this model. And then when you aggregate it up, you still get an aggregate consumption function, but with that heterogeneity underneath it. We have this kind of Tobin's Q investment capital stock equations, an NFA equation in the small open economy case. In the dynastic case, the human wealth equation looks very standard. And then you have a kind of Tobin's Q equation for the installation cost of capital investment approach. Next slide, please. And then this shows you, again, sort of the same behavior, law of motion for the closed economy model. The key difference here is that the interest rate has to equilibrate saving and investment. And you can see that it's a function of, from the supply side, the marginal product of capital and net of depreciation related to the interest rate, and then also from the demand side, the behavior of consumption and human wealth, and also the marginal propensity to consume, all depend on the interest rate on the saving side, and affect the interest rate has to adjust to equilibrate saving and investment in that framework. Next slide, please. This just shows you adding liquidity constraints, how the model changes. The easiest place to see that is in the top line. You see that consumption is a function of both. I think there's probably a 1 minus lambda missing in front of HT there, but consumption is a function of permanent income consumers and current income consumers. What we showed you on the surfaces is that the role of current income consumers adds a little bit of non-neutrality in the model, but not as much as the effects of the behavior of permanent income consumers operating through the stock of human wealth. You saw that in the surfaces there, that channel is the bigger source of Ricardian non-neutrality in this model than through the flow channel, which is through the liquidity constrained consumers. Next slide, please. That's it. So I think hopefully that gives you a sense of what this kind of framework can buy you, the role of heterogeneity in the overlapping generations model, how do you interpret the model differently when you think about agents as dynastic households and overlapping barrow dynasties in one case versus overlapping individuals in the other, what that means in terms of the channels through which debt non-neutralities kind of come into this framework. And as you can see, the debt non-neutralities can get larger and larger. We didn't show you a few slides. They're in the working paper, that when you put in all the pieces, you put in the liquidity constraints, you can add in demographic changes, you can add in the life cycle income profiles, and you can add in different assumptions for the nature of the utility function. You can get some very sizable non-neutralities, even larger than the ones that I showed you here. But the intuition is broadly the same. This wedge between private and public discount rates are a key feature in the model. Those come from the heterogeneity, the overlapping generations framework that we have here. When you have a framework where agents look different from one another, they look different now, they look different in the future, they incorporate in forward-looking behavior, they incorporate those things in their decision-making. That's what generates the kinds of model properties that you saw in this framework that allow these kind of non-Ricardian properties to can get very, very large depending on the types of modeling assumptions that you use. And this kind of framework was nice in the sense that it nested a lot of those alternative interpretations. So you can map out those surfaces and see in what range could you be in where the effects of government debt could have actually very large real implications for, say, the interest rate or the capital stock or the level of net foreign assets for a particular economy.